most of the things that you kind of set for yourself are totally achievable.
That's Mandeep Soor, co-founder and CEO of Bendy. They just raised $1 million to help companies to deal with risk.
We look at like 100 different variables and we're helping companies to figure out if that's in their supply chain. Along that, it's what we don't just want to be the bearer of bad news.
She's not had a simple journey, and there's a lot you can learn from her experience.
It was very working class. It was like my parents wanted me to do well at school, but they didn't know how. You don't know the rules.
She's worked at places like British Business Bank and Lehman Brothers too.
Taught me a lot about like how to think. We're really, really positive to giving you those skills. Yeah, have the audacity to be like, yeah.
We cover big mistakes.
It was a really amazing tech product, but it wasn't useful.
And Mandeep gets unfiltered on topics like hiring and fundraising too.
I shouldn't say these things in public. We're just going to be really candid here, right? So the first thing I wanted to do when I was little, I wanted to be an artist. I think I just like enjoyed drawing and painting things. But like most Indian parents, mine were like, no, don't do that. They spent quite a lot of time assuaging me of that particular kind of avenue of life. Yeah.
Have you ever like picked up again later in life any art?
Bits and bobs, yeah. Probably more music than arts, or maybe a bit of writing. And I think actually being a founder is really creative, not in a very different way. And you get to be creative with other people. So I think I'm not lacking in creativity in my life. Probably the idea of sitting somewhere and just painting something for like hours and days, it actually doesn't excite me as much anymore.
We've been told off for not having artwork in the office. So if you want to draw something for the office or paint something, we'll take it. So obviously you didn't then go to study art. What did you go and study? What did you then go down?
I studied economics. I did my undergrads in economics at SOAS. So it was like economics with a kind of a real focus on developing economics and Southeast Asia. So I did instead of writing essays about New York, I was writing essays about the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which was fascinating, or like the Chinese kind of cultural revolution and Mao. And yeah, it's just a fascinating perspective on how the world works and how different economies develop and grow and where growth comes from and how you manufacture growth. And yeah, it was a really great place to study that. And then I went on and did philosophy at the LSE, which was also really great. Yeah.
And so obviously you then went from philosophy and to the Southeast Asia, to Lehman Brothers, was very famous for their philosophy and their deep thinking.
No, I did the philosophy a bit later. So my original degree was in I did economics as an undergrad and a master's, and I went to Lehman Brothers because it was a really lucrative role, and my parents were like, go and get paid. Also, I'd funded myself through university, so I was pretty skint by that point. And it was a really, really fascinating experience, right? So I was there just before they went down for the credit crisis. So
nothing to do with that.
No, I did. Yeah, I did. In my tiny little insignificant way. Like one of the first things I had to do was structure some mortgage books from Ireland. I didn't know what a mortgage book was. And yeah, reflecting back on it, I'm like, that wasn't great. But it's so interesting when you're surrounded by people who everybody's doing it, you kind of normalize so much of what you do. And yeah, it was just like, oh, well, how do we price the risk? Oh, this makes sense. Okay, I priced it. I've made some models. That seems reasonable. 10 months later, it's like, okay, I mean, Ireland completely crashed. Much of the world's economies went through like a horrific credit crisis.
So what came next? Did you go into philosophy or did you carry on working?
No, I carried on in the corporate world. Many of the people that I'd known who'd worked there had gone to become consultants who were then advising banks. So I became a consultant. So I moved to BCG. I joined their kind of banking function. And I spent almost half a decade there. Really, I think, it was a bit of I think worked with some of the smartest people I've ever met. Also really helpful. Just given the kind of background that I'd had, it was kind of an incredible experience. You kind of have somebody who has very little life experience finding ways to recommend how other people should run their business because of like well-established models. Taught me a lot about like how to think.
Yeah.
But eventually I was like, well, I care about shareholder value, but I don't know if that's the only thing I care about. And there's a lot of the work that I was doing was like cost cutting. So I really wanted to be a lot more involved in growth. I thought that I also really kind of believed in like positive change, and I thought the government would be a wonderful place to go and do that. So I moved to the British Business Bank. I was probably the second person to join their strategy team. And they just started, I think when I joined, it was like less than 100 people.
Yeah.
And when I left, it was like 300. So they were really like, doing a huge amount to grow venture and early stage funding in the UK. And so I did a range of different stuff there, including working on a co-investment fund. And that's where I got the bug for startup. I think when I graduated, people weren't like starting companies, especially not so much like from my socioeconomic backgrounds. But yeah, this time, like it was like 10 years later or something, it was like, I was just meeting all these founders and they was full of so much energy and inspiration. I thought, great, I want to do that. I didn't realize they hadn't been to sleep for like 5 years.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, like you said as well, because I think a huge part of the startup revolution in the UK, why more people are interested in it. Now it's like, okay, the incentive has changed. And I think now that's why there's been that shift in the last 10 years or so, more great people going into the tech world as opposed to just going straight into finance.
But also in tech, you get to drive change in a way or feel like you're driving change. Whereas when you're in a large corporate, it's really hard to feel like you're moving the needle on something. And when you're at a startup, even if your share of equity is small, you've got something and you've got skin in the game.
Yeah.
And I think that's a wonderful incentive, really.
And you mentioned about people from your socioeconomic background going into this space.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that. Give us some more context.
So my parents are pretty working class. I grew up in Southeast London, which was like very predominantly working class, white. At some point, my parents moved to Southall, which, if anybody who knows, is the polar opposite. I think they just had this experience of, I think, like 70s and 80s in the UK in a white predominant location was quite racially challenging, and so they really wanted to move into something that felt like community. So we moved to Southall. It was kind of this interesting realization for me of like suddenly moving from a white majority environment to a kind of Asian or Indian majority environment. It's almost jarring, actually. It was like, oh, I don't listen to Bollywood music, and or just like other things. I just didn't have the social capital for that, and I didn't have the social capital for the kind of Western world in which I'd grown up in as well. I also spent like the first few years of my life living in India because my mum and my aunt didn't have UK status, so there was a lot of like, I think my parents basically wanted to move back to India back in the day, and eventually they just realised that there was no moving back for them. And so then they were like, let's set up shop in the closest thing to what is India in the UK, which is South. And if you've been there, it's like you can get by without speaking any English. Like my grandmother, bless her, right to the end of her life, didn't speak any English. And you can just do that because you can speak Hindi or Punjabi to any shopkeeper and do all the things that you need. But it was very working class. It was like my parents wanted me to do well at school, but they didn't know how. So you'd come home with this like problem, and they'd be like, "Okay, work hard on it," but nobody would see how to fix it. So you kind of just like, so there's a lot of that, and I think having mentorship as I've grown older has been like a really amazing part of like growth and support to kind of access different parts of like social capital in my life.
And you mentioned there as well, so you've obviously been at Lehman, you've been at British Business Bank, which are quite big institutions, right? And do you feel like that working class background affected you at all in that environment, or did not really have any effect there?
I think one of the greatest like dividers that we have is class, actually, more than race and sometimes, right? And I'm not saying, but for me, it's felt like class is a bigger divider than race. And what it gives you is access to, I've said it so many times already, but like, you know people, you have network, you understand concepts, you have kind of confidence around things. And I think that is a function of lots of stuff, but I think class really becomes one of it. But actually those environments were really, really positive to giving me those skills that have allowed me to then go and become an entrepreneur and try and build something of my own. And have the audacity to be like, I reckon I could do it.
It's one of those. So I grew up in Ilford originally, right?
Okay.
And it's the whole thing of like how I speak now is very different to how I spoke growing up. And my co-founder's from Southall, right?
Okay.
So we're basically the most like obviously Asian areas in London we're both from, right? And coming from that background, I think, as I said, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage because you might not have the network growing up and things like that. But it also just means you see things from a different lens. And it just, like you said, is like, well, I can do it. And it's just, you sometimes have that different environment. You're not as put into the boundaries as maybe other people are because you haven't grown up with those rules in the same way they have.
You don't know the rules.
Yeah. Exactly. I still don't know the rules. Yeah.
No.
It's like, it's part of the reason why BHG works is that we're not, I think so many organizations like us, they're trying so hard to be so kind of uptight and posh, which I think is actually quite off-putting to a lot of people. Whereas like, I'm always probably looking rough and whatever, but it's just that it means that it's just a bit more, we're just normal, right? And that helps people who maybe don't feel like belong in other spaces. They'll come to our events, be like, oh, okay, these are people who are like me, who I can get along with. I know you said it's one element of race, but its element is, I think, class as well, of just like, I feel comfortable. I don't feel like I need to put on something to be in this room.
And there's a lot of just like fake it till you make it, right? And then you suddenly realize that you're not faking it anymore. This is like where you're at. This is what your life is like. And most of the things that you kind of set for yourself, or I'd set for myself, they're totally achievable.
And so you mentioned your ideas, well, the ideas become a founder came with British Business Bank.
Right.
And did you have an idea of what the idea was going to be, or were you more looking for an idea of like, what's the problem I want to solve? How did the idea for Bendy come about?
So the idea for Bendy took a while. I worked at a couple of startups, and one was a data science consultancy / platform. I got to be chief of staff there for the CEO, which I think is a great entryway into learning about all of the parts of a business, right? Everything from hiring to fundraising to firing and to kind of, people management to operations and everything. The stuff that I think, I don't know if they teach this at school, but certainly when I was there, it wasn't something, and maybe they teach you this at business schools, but certainly wasn't something that I knew about. And I loved the tech. So I think my perspective was like, I was inspired by the potential for growth, and I was inspired by the technology. And I think I've always been really, really interested in the tech. And so, but we were building tech tools for retailers, mostly to kind of help them be more profitable with maybe some of their customer data, or helping them figure out like where their complaints were, so they're like cutting their costs. And it's a pretty interesting problem. But I also wanted to do something with a social agenda and impact, and my kind of heart was really, really into that. And so one of my first co-founder, Ben, I'd known him from university, from my days at SOAS. He'd gone and done really, really different things. He'd worked in climate change policy and in Brussels. He'd worked at like large carbon accounting companies like CDP. And he was at the time working for the supply chain team at Burberry. And the kind of challenges that he was having there, or that we were like, okay, there's something here.
Yeah.
And I started like an accelerator while I was still working at Pivigo at the data science place. And then lockdown happened. And I think that's when I really started like working on this side hustle thing, and until it became the full hustle. And our first idea was really a consumer facing product. It helped people to choose their products that would be more ethical in some way. But the data is not that great. So you're using kind of averages, and you're not really able to say something very concrete about products. It was a really amazing tech product, but it wasn't useful.
Yeah.
And I think that was the first kind of thing. It's like you can make a beautiful, elegant product, but if people aren't going to pay for it and it's not really that useful, then you don't have a business. So that was lesson number one. And there's been a lot of lessons ever since. And I think, drilling down to the problem, like really solving something that's painful has been an ongoing journey. I think in some ways I feel like we're doing Bendy 3.0 because we pivoted a couple of times and we're learning every step along the way. And then Ollie joined us, we knew we needed someone who was technical. So the third co-founder, and we've learned so. And in fact, since he joined, we started becoming a lot more successful. So I think that said something for his contribution as well. And he'd worked with big data at The Economist. He'd worked at Circle CI, which makes dev tools for Deliveroo and Meta. So he was really, really comfortable in that enterprise SaaS and tech space. So that, along with a real, somebody who experienced the commercial problem. Hopefully some of my kind of learnings from consultancy and just working with large corporates and what Ollie was doing in terms of enterprise, together we were okay, we can get closer and hone into the problem a bit more.
So what is Bendy 3.0? What is it? What if you had to tell people listening right now in one line what you do?
So we're helping companies to source and make their products safely. And by safely, I mean from suppliers that are don't have risks around environmental and governance and social. So social could be anything like human rights abuses. It could be issues around forced labor and the kind of environmental space. We found things around, like a dump of chemicals, for example. And then in the governance space, it's, is there something in the corporate structure where actually one of the parent companies or one of the people involved in there is on a banned entity list, politically exposed people? So we look at 100 different variables and we're helping companies to figure out if that's in their supply chain. And I think that, along that, it's what we don't just want to be the bearer of bad news. Sometimes there's opportunities within that. So if you're not working with this supplier, you could work with this other one. If you're looking to change your supply chain and work in new areas, how can we help you figure out what the risk looks like in that? And risk isn't a bad thing, right? Risk is just, I'm willing to take this much risk for this much return. Right. And that's what it is. You might be willing to work in a country with higher risk if the price is low enough. Yeah. And sometimes you might not. So it varies by company what they're willing to take and what their price point is. Sometimes it's based on quality, sometimes it's based on something else, but effectively we're helping them to make and source their products in a safe way.
Hello. Quick interruption to let you know about Bay HQ. We're the community for high growth British Asian entrepreneurs, operators and investors, and you can join completely free at thebayhq.com/join. There you get our CEO pillars, so that's content, events and opportunities direct to your inbox every week so you can get involved and it can help you to further your business and your career. We also have a free startup course called Bay Startup Foundations, where if you think about starting a business someday or at the early stages, it gives you all that information to help you hit the ground running and to thrive in this new world. Back to the show. It's one of these things I think, it's one of the scariest things about owning a business, right? Is that there's always these random tail risks you don't think about.
Right.
So we've got work experience students coming in, right?
Okay.
So then we had people come in to assess our workspace and do we have all the stuff? I was I feel like this, never heard of that before. There's all these things, but it's really important. And I think what you're doing now is obviously there's going to be people at all these businesses, your potential clients, who are going to be listening I'm really worried about stuff, but I have no idea how to go about it. And it's sometimes those things which you don't know or you don't know are really big opportunities that people miss out on sometimes, and they don't look for those problems as much. But when you realize, okay, for these different companies, obviously they're going to want to know this information, then that's where there's a big market. And I think sometimes people get more obsessed with the consumer side because it's what's natural as a consumer. You notice that. And that shift towards working more with businesses, how has that been for you in terms of that initial idea and that evolution?
I think, yes, one bit of advice that someone told me, or one of my mentors told me, was businesses are people too. You're not selling to the business, you're selling to a person.
Yeah.
And before you're even selling to them, you're building some sort of connection. Do you have a problem that you want to solve, right? And so you're figuring out are you the person who has the problem that we could help you with? And so, we've talked to lots of different people around that, whether it's like the sustainability person or the procurement person. Recently, we're talking to kind of risk managers. It's a multifaceted problem, but it requires lots of different people, and you're building connections with those individuals rather than looking at it like, does this company? Of course, if the company's like goal and agenda is completely not aligned with what we're doing, then yeah, sure, that makes sense. But I think you have to treat in each individual as a person and connect with them and their needs and what is it they're trying to achieve in their job, and can I help them do that?
And obviously you have to do it at the beginning, right? You're talking to different people at different companies to work out who's the right person to talk to. Is this a problem that needs solving? Are people willing to pay for this? How did you go about that as well, of getting the research about this side of things?
I'm still doing it, is the real truth. And we've gotten much better at it. Like, I think we had a phase where we had a third party go and do a bunch of interviews with us and for us, because we thought, okay, if we do the interviews, people might lie to us. And so we had other people test drive the product, but also do a bunch of interviews. But the thing is, when you're not there, you're sort of removed and you're not able to ask maybe the questions that you might have, or ingesting it in the same way. So yeah, you can have there's all sorts of pros and cons around this. Like, one of the things that I'm recently learning is when you're talking to customers, especially before you know they're your customer, it's less about you're kind of using the techniques that you do almost like an interrogation. Yeah. You're trying to dig into the thing that they really care about and just give them lots and lots of space to be able to talk about it. Every single person we speak to, we're like, hey, can you introduce us to 2 more people? That has been really, really fruitful, because you have a bunch of assumptions and you're building credence for or against those assumptions constantly. And that helps you then define your next feature, your product roadmap. Everything comes from that.
And obviously you mentioned there about bringing Ollie on, and you've been growing the team quite significantly in the last couple of years as well.
I mean, we're still only 10 people.
Yeah. I mean, from 2 people.
Yes.
That's by that.
Yeah.
So how's that experience of being a chief of staff been able to help you there? And like, what do you look for when you're trying to grow the team and find the right people?
Yeah, I think being like the co-founder, leader of a small startup is super tough, because you basically need people who will, I think in a normal environment, and I definitely did this just going to be really candid here, right? Like, I think in the beginning of Bendy, I really wanted to help people grow, and we still do. Like, we take interns, and I think, as you were saying, giving people job experience, and I think that's, it's a fantastic thing to do. But you're taking away from some of the kind of bandwidth that you would have about growing the business. So basically, the person has to be like almost carved perfectly to help grow the business. And that's what you're looking for. You're like, are you the kind of person that's going to, like, is it going to take me a huge amount of effort to help you grow? Or are you going to hit the floor running and help the business grow? And that's it. And you're just figuring that out. And if they ask lots of really smart questions like, how does my role fit in with the big agenda? How does this help you achieve X, Y, Z? I've had people who are like barely 20 ask me, well, if I do this, how does high level decision making work with that? And I'm like, okay, great. You've got the right attitude, right?
Yes.
Whereas the person who's like, I don't know, who even has an MBA, frankly, and then I've interviewed them and they said, okay, well, what do you think of this? Do you think this is what you're looking for? It's like, oh, it's probably not the right fit. I don't know. Yeah. I need you to come in and be like, I think this is what we should do, and here are my 3 reasons why. And then I'm like, okay, let's do it.
Yeah,
it's ruthless in that way.
I think a huge part of it, like you said, is are they making an effort to understand how things fit together?
Yeah.
Or is it this? I need to tick this box, because in a corporate you can tick a box, right? And it's like, okay, this is my job. I need to do this.
Right.
But when everything is moving so fast, you need somebody who's going to think, okay, in 3 months' time, I'm going to be there. Is what I'm doing, how is it relevant to where we're going to be, not just where we are today?
Yeah.
Because it is that constant growth and the change, right?
Yeah.
And obviously in the last year, I think it's October, was it, when you did your race, right? And how was that experience as well? Because that was the first time you've done that, right? To that larger extent.
Yeah, so when we were raising, that was predominantly what we were doing. Like before that, I would say research laboratory, we're building a product and you're taking lots of information and we're kind of trying to do a few pilots and get enough like validation for that to go and do a raise. Then it was like full guns blazing. All I did was raise. Once the raise was done, hire. So all I did was like interviews upon interviews for several months while also trying. And now predominantly all I do is sales. So every 3 months, my job has completely changed.
What's your favorite season of that?
I'm quite enjoying the current season, actually. I've never done it before. Probably should.
We can cut that.
But no, it's right. I think not in this way. So I think in consulting, yes, some extent. But you walk in and people don't even care what my name is. They're like, "Where did you work?" And you say these like few initials or like the letters, and then they open the door. And now it's like, "Oh, hi, I'm Mandeep from Bendy," and they're like, "Who? From where?" Like it's like you really have to justify yourself, and you just really, I think, thinking about so much empathy around what it is that you're trying to do and who you're trying to help, and they're super interesting. And it's also quite, I would say, tactical as well, which I quite like. And you're reinventing who you are, which I think, given where I started from in my life, I'm like, there's a bit of me that really enjoys this reinvention.
Yeah.
So now it's like, okay, sales, head of sales. Okay, that's the new me. Great. Let's figure out what that looks like and let's try and be good at that.
Yeah, because I see it a lot with pitch decks, for example, right? Of somebody starting a business like X Goldman Sachs or X this, X that. And it's like, you've got to work out how is that relevant to like the next bit of the story, right? And you see it all the time. And it's when somebody's come from that corporate background, sometimes, like you said, they've been able to rely on, they can get a door open just because of those initials. Whereas when it's a startup, it's like, they're not just going to invest in you just because of somewhere you worked for 2 months, 10 years ago. And I think it's quite a good like learning process, right? You then got to, like you said, understand, how do I actually show what I'm doing is valuable or was like, making a difference here? And like, what was obviously for you when you were doing that at the beginning? What were some of your biggest learnings that you found got more effective at pitching later on? Like, how did you hone that pitch over time?
It's a never-ending honing of learning new things and learning how to talk differently to different people. I think that's probably one of the best learnings that I've had. Don't try and use the same thing on everyone. That doesn't work. Maybe some people would disagree, but I feel that this whole experience has made me a much better listener. When I started, it was like, hey, I've got this thing to offer you. Are you interested? Whatever. I've like had 30 people do her same thing to me in the last like 2 months. That's not great. Instead, if I offer myself as that like therapist at work, so what's the challenge for you? What's painful about that? How badly do you want to fix it? What have you tried? And that's a really, really different approach, and I find that is working much better. And the goal is not to just like get in there and sell. Our goal is to really understand. So it's just a completely different perspective. I think sales has got a bad like rap, right? But if we change that to empathy and understanding of a problem deeply, then I think once you can get to that, the next bit is pretty straightforward.
So looking at the next bit, right? So what we're saying to people now, so we're over 200 episodes in for this podcast.
Right.
So we started to now get the people on right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And like, some of them asked like, oh, where do you want to see yourself in the future? Where do you see your company going? So now it's going to be in 200 episodes time. Let's say you're sitting here again. What do you hope that you could say, okay, Bendy's achieved this?
I mean, I think there's a few different things, but one thing that I would really like for us at Bendy is to have product market fit, right? We're trying a bunch of different things, and it's about seeing which one sticks, or which one fits perfectly, because that allows you to scale. So I think if there was in 2 years' time, I would hope that we would have done the next round of raise with something that looks like clear product market fits from a kind of Bendy perspective. On a personal perspective, I hope that my role changes again. All right, I think what I'm doing now will probably be redundant in some way, or be like a completely different group of people who are then running the kind of, I would say, sales momentum for us. Yeah, which also feels kind of exciting. I think the really exciting thing about startup, right, is you're constantly changing, and you're growing. So growth.
Because now what we're going to try and do is like, so in 2 years' time, we'll show you that little clip.
Okay.
And you can then see like, okay, did I get it or not get it?
Yeah.
And like what went differently to what you expected as well.
Yeah.
But what would you say today is like you're most proud about with Bendy?
It's actually a really good point. I'm just going to go back to this other point around the 2 years, because I did something like that for 1 year where I wrote an email and then it sends you the email in a year. And that was equally fascinating. So I was keeps thinking that I'm going to do like something like with me and my partner. We should do that on an annual basis. But it's a good idea. So I think we're a really humble team who, as a group of founders, I think we've learned a huge amount together, and we're really able to kind of take on learnings and be resilient. I think some of the things that we've been through, I've seen others completely crumble. And, you know, there's something about building a working kind of relationship where no matter what, you can kind of see the other person's point of view, and you can learn from each other constantly. And we're so different, I think, both as people, but also as our backgrounds, which that diversity can be a accelerator of growth, but it can also be quite a source of friction at times, right? Because if you all agree on the same thing, then you never have any problems. But if you disagree, then people can see different things, and that can really build in opportunities, which I think has been our absolute strength. And we've never let it get to the point where we're like, nah, I disagree with you so much, I'm walking away, which I've seen. I think it's one of the top 3 reasons why startups fail. And I've seen it, sadly, many times.
Yeah, and it's one of those funny things. We always tell people you should get a co-founder agreement, but me and Gervie don't have one ourselves. So it's like, as I say, not as I do, yeah.
Yeah, we never got one until our investors asked for one in the last round, and the lead investor was like, you've got to do one. We're like, what's this? Yeah, okay, we'll do it. Yeah.
So obviously as well, like social impact is a big part of this view, right? And how by the technology you're providing and how that's going to help companies do things in a better way.
Right.
And what's some of the impact you've made so far, and what's some of the impact you hope to make?
I think so far it's mostly, if I'm completely honest, it's mostly, you know, it's been a regulatory requirement, right? So there are some companies who really want to do it because they believe that this is the right thing. But it's mostly been driven by, I don't want my product to be stopped at border. I don't want blah, blah, blah. I need to complete this sort of assessment. And I think that's the reality that we see. In the future, some of the things that we're really hoping to do is bring in some of the most, so far it's been a lot of, okay, this is something bad that's happened. But once we bring in something around more about what positive things suppliers can do, then it will hopefully bring flight to the best, but also allow suppliers to kind of improve conditions. One of the things that we're also quite interested in is once you find an issue, this like long-term remediation piece. We haven't actually been part of that yet, but it's something that we've explored and I find really interesting. So you find a risk, maybe there were some like workplace issues, but you don't stop working with a supplier. You try to get a third party in, maybe there's some management training, maybe there's some upskilling of staff. And in that way, you work with them 6 months, 8 months to do better. And I think that actually really changes the playing field.
Okay, so we're going to jump to quick fire questions now.
Okay.
So first one, which you're prepared for now, is who are 3 British Asians or Asians in Britain you think are doing incredible work and you'd love to shout them out?
Okay. Probably the Mayor of London. I think Sadiq Khan's amazing. I've always been a really, really big fan. Another would be Shanika Amarasekara, who is actually both a ex-boss at the BBB and mentor, and then also one of my first investors. You know, when you're like, is anybody going to invest in assets? You say, oh, I'll invest in you. That was that moment where we're like, oh, maybe we're onto something. I shouldn't say this in public, right? And she's just been a great supporter.
I think a lot of people have that worry in their heads, right?
I think at the beginning, it's amazing. I see this real split, and I don't know, or how that division. I think it doesn't play out in the end. Now I'm like, this is great. But asked me like 4 years ago, I was like, I'm not sure. And another person I'd love to shout out is a dear friend of mine, but also an amazing writer is Shuru. She's written a beautiful book called The Kindness Method. I can really, really recommend it. She's done another one as well, like The Last Diet. And she, wonderful writer, works in the space of addiction and self-care. So big up.
And then if people want to find out more about you, more about Bendy, where do they go to?
They can go on my website. They can contact me on LinkedIn. They can...
What's your website?
www.bendy.ai. So BENDI.ai.
And is there anything that you need help with right now that the audience listening might be able to help you with?
Yeah, I think always, right? We're doing lots and lots of interviews at the moment, as I was saying, with people in procurement, with people in sourcing. So if you work at or you know someone who works at a company and you have a sourcing role, you have a procurement role, we'd love to chat to you. That would be super, super helpful. If there's anything I can do in return, really happy to do that as well. In fact, just at your events yesterday, this kind of conversation happened. And then the guy was like, oh, I'm thinking of starting something in my own business and I would love to connect. So we already connected today and going to grab a coffee. So I think network is fantastic.
So really enjoyed having you on today.
Thank you very much.
Have you got any final words?
I mean, if I get to have a fourth person, then it can be you, for sure. I think you're doing really fantastic work with the Asian community and big shout out.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.